And for me, when I first started, I was working really diligently, and then I took a 5-year break. And all throughout that time, whenever I met him, he would still encourage me in the program. In fact, a lot of times, he was the one who got me charged up, and he was more excited about my research than I was at times. But he really believed in me, and I am really blessed to be able to introduce him as a mentor, as a good friend, and as someone who continues to inspire me to be the best kingdom leader that I could be. So please, everyone, welcome Dr. Doug McConnell.
Do you want to hear that again? That was just great. I'm really privileged to be here today and to speak with you. I was on sabbatical when we had the last conference, and therefore I missed it, and I feel bad about that, so I'm kind of playing catch-up. But I'm very delighted to be with you. And what I decided to do today, in the midst of the scholars that have presented, I was here for many of the things yesterday, and I was so impressed with the level of the discourse. I decided to present to you a kind of view from where I stand in my journey, and perhaps use Fuller as a little bit of a case study, but not exclusively. One of the things that got a hold of my heart as a young man, as a young Christian, was God's call on our lives, our mission in the world. I am, by academic training, a missiologist, which combines urban anthropology, in my case, and theology. And I've been so impressed by the way that God has given the mission a church. So often we say God's church has a mission. I think it's better to say God's mission has a church. And I've had the privilege of serving that church on 3 different continents and in many different locations. I started out my service as a minister of the gospel in 1974 when my wife and I went to Australia. And we lived there for a number of years. We lived then in Papua New Guinea for a number of years. I went from being a school teacher to being a pastor to be a mission leader. So for 17 years I served that way. Then I came back and went to Wheaton College as a professor, and then 5 more years as a mission director, and then I've been here for the last 8 years as dean. And one of the things that has impressed me is the fact that in our world, we can't really talk about a world. We have to talk about worlds, plural, because depending on where you stand, the world will look very different. And my pilgrimage has been one of trying to understand the intercultural interplay of various worlds. So I'd like to share a little bit of that reflection with you today. Let me start with a statement that Jesus makes that I find incredibly powerful, and I use as a springboard to my understanding of both my theology but also the understanding of identity. Jesus met with the disciples behind closed doors after the resurrection, and you can imagine the picture. All of the disciples locked in a room for fear. And depending on where you are in the world, you could find yourself today locked behind doors for fear. It could be Cairo. It could be somewhere in Sudan. It could be Orissa province or Orissa state in India. It could be in various places. So this scenario is not historic as much as it is geographic. It has gone from then to now. And so Jesus appeared to them, and he gave the traditional greeting, shalom, peace be with you. The idea of my peace be with you. He had already accounted for that, and the Gospel of John accounts for that concept of Jesus' peace. But he offered that to them, and then he said these words, ones you know well. Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. It seems to me that if we take seriously Jesus' commission, Jesus' commandment to live in our world, whatever world that is, in such a way that reflects his purpose in the world, God's own purpose in the world, then we've got to do some adaptation in order to do that. We need to live a life that brings glory to the God who calls us into that world. And so as we think about that, we begin to think about what are the dimensions, and one of the dimensions is our social engagement, our social interaction. In missiology, we like to talk about the cultural mandate, which is recorded in Genesis 1, the concept that after God created humankind, God went on to say, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and every other living thing that moves upon the earth. God said, and goes on to talk about what God had given. So the idea of living in a kind of stewardship of our world rather than a usership of our world. And so that social world becomes a place. Now, one of the things that I've done over the years is studied how people form their identities. And I started out in the South Pacific doing this, keeping in mind that the South Pacific is made up of small islands. And those small islands were essentially homogeneous units. They were broken up by clans, but they tended to be one identity. We don't know much about that, except one could argue that perhaps in Japan or in Korea for a season there was homogeneity, but that isn't true today. It's both of those countries, and particularly Korea, is rapidly becoming a diverse environment, which is a bit of a shock over what it used to be. For example, I was at a conference in Cairo, and it was a conference where 20 Christians and 280 Muslim scholars were invited to have dialogue. 280 to 20 is not a very good dialogue ratio. I want you to know that, and I was a little intimidated. I listened for 5 days to Arabic translated into English in varying degrees of accuracy. At one point, I had worried that one of my colleagues had left Orthodox Christianity and become a Buddhist, but actually it was just a translation problem. But anyway, as I was there, one of the things that I discovered in that area is that a very profound paper was presented by a Korean Muslim leader who heads up a mosque and Islamic studies in Seoul. I don't think of Seoul that way. I land at the airport at Seoul, at Incheon, I take the bus in, and I see the red crosses lit up in the skyline at night. And I almost weep, because I am 60 years old this year, and it was 60 years ago that the Korean War was at its height and just beginning to emerge. And I look at what God has done on the landscape, and so visibly, that I think of Seoul as a city, for me, as a city where the gospel has just had such a powerful impact. And I take pride in being associated with brothers and sisters in that part of the world. But in fact, I was sitting in Cairo listening to this Islamic leader using missiology, as it were. He was saying, this is a wide open context. There's much receptivity to Islam. We need to put more money and more time. And it sounded like a mission pep rally at one of the churches that you attend. So we live in a world in which these social worlds can collide fairly quickly. And my little island nations of the Pacific my experience there began to show me that those worlds can collide quite quickly. One of the things that we saw, next slide please, in terms of identity formation is that part of the world had what Lincoln and Poyer said, social relationships and biography no longer determine personal identity. An arbitrary and externally imposed categorization comes increasingly to shape a person's life. That in fact, the pristine cultures and areas in that particular part of the world, this is a technology problem, I'll read it to you, you can trust me for the first half of the words. Or not, it's up to you. Anyway, what the point is that external forces are acting upon the social identity. Now, the islands of the South Pacific were like a laboratory for the study of social identity. We were able to look at those cultures, we were able to see the changes come in, and the impact of globalization was much more measurable than it was in a place like Japan or Korea or Singapore or China or New York or Los Angeles or anywhere like that because of the complexity of variables. But one of the things that we began to note was imported or incoming forces tended to have a shaping effect on social identity, on who we are and how we know who we are. And as we began to look at that, I began to recognize that those dimensions have multiple facets to them. It's easy to see it. The media, we heard about that some yesterday, the concept of media, the way we write history, the way we talk about that, education, business, all of these kinds of things begin to have an importation of who you are. And who we understand ourselves to be is often shaped externally as well as internally. And so that dynamic is one that surprises no one, but is fairly clearly recorded. Now, in following that up, one group of social scientists, particularly sociologists, began to look at how that happened in a city. They tried to get their arms around a dynamic that they could watch. And there was a Berkeley sociologist by the name of Claude Fisher who did a study in Northern California of communities from very rural Northern California communities right to the Tenderloin of San Francisco, and began to look at how identities are shaped and how people interact socially in order to shape those identities. He did a study, pass 2 and go to the next one. It says social networks. 2 slides, thanks. Can we do it or should we abandon it? Okay. It's social networks at the top. Anyway, he did this study, and what he identified was that people began to shape their worlds themselves, that there was human agency, there was action, it wasn't just being acted upon. And he wrote, and I'm quoting, "Within their constraints and their preferences, people tend to associate with others like themselves." Let me repeat that. People tend to associate with others like themselves. In that sense, social networks are inbred. As a consequence of, and a further cause of, this inwardly turned interaction, people come to share many experiences, attitudes, beliefs, and values. In short, they develop a common culture. And what Fisher was pointing out is that identities may start by what you're given by your birth, but as you grow up, you have more and more choice in how you formulate your social world. As a result of that, it begins to shape who you are and your identity. So you choose, that choice affects you, you choose again, it comes back. And so there's that interaction. Again, these forces working together. This concept of subculture became an important tool, particularly as we look at more complex societies and how we identify people in that way. Now, my observation over the years has been that when people migrate from one place to another, they tend to head toward a place of geographic safety. And so you'll find populations of whatever ethnic group is migrating tend to want to be near one another. It's an exercise of choice, and there are a lot of reasons. Churches can supply opportunities for people to reinforce their identity. They're kind of a safety place, and so we begin to see that happening. And if you drive around Los Angeles, you'll see that. If you go straight south of here, about 2 suburbs down, all of the signs turn to Chinese. In Monterey Park, along the streets, and you'll see that. If you had a different direction, all the signs are in Spanish. If you had a particular direction, you can actually find signs in Farsi, which is the language of the places like Iraq and Iran, the area of Turkey east. And so you have groups of people speaking in that way. Now the interesting thing is when those groups get together, they start to interact so that the choice becomes more choice. And we heard from our brother Eugene Cho last night, which, by the way, if I could commute from Pasadena to Quest Church, I think I'd transfer. I mean, and I like to take people with me. Was he great or what? If he was from Fuller, he'd be perfect. That whole Princeton thing, I didn't work for me. But anyway, just kidding. But the point is, the kinds of choices that we get become more complex when you live in more complex environments. And one of the things that we're beginning to notice is that identity formation is affected particularly in the area of your growing up days, your schooling and that kind of thing. And so it's a phenomenon that's fairly well documented, and I'm sure many of you have read that and are aware of that. But one of the things that came back to me was the concept that this kind of identity formation has a very strong impact on our communities as a seminary, as churches, and as others. And so herein comes the case study. One is outside forces, the other the concept of choice. One of the things that I have noticed at Fuller is that there is an emerging conversation around who I am and how I know who I am. The question of social identity or personal identity. Who am I and how do I know who I am? We've begun to respond to that in ways that we see as logical. We have a Hispanic Studies program. We have an African American Studies program. We have various groupings of people on the campus. We've had a very major thrust, particularly in the light of the last conference, toward beginning to talk more as Asian Americans on campus. We have Korean Studies and all Korean, and we're increasingly talking about Mandarin speaking involvement. And one of the things that happens is that you begin to see a place where your identity can be reinforced within community. And the challenge that I think is before us right now is the reinforcement of that identity in a way that invites support from the community. One of the dangers that we have is that when you long for an identity that's apart from the majority can actually turn against you. We've seen that. We've seen it over and over again. We're seeing it amongst Turks in Germany right now. There are all kinds of issues that happen in that way. One of the things that I am excited about Fuller about is that we have the opportunity as brothers and sisters in Christ to actually affirm one another's identity without losing anything, gaining rather than losing. You're not saying I'm losing mine, but I'm gaining. And that takes a lot of challenge and a lot of thought. Because one of the things, if what happens is that every class that we offer in Hispanic Studies has only Hispanics in it, and every class that we have on Women's Studies has only women in it, and Asian American Studies and only Asian American, what we're really doing is we're creating a diversity that isn't permeable. It's not malleable. There's no way that we can actually grow together. And one of the concerns that I have, particularly sitting where I do in this institution, is that we begin to help others do that. And the exciting thing right now, working with Daniel and with young Lee and others, is that we're in a position where we can actually think about that in a very solid way. One of my biggest fears is that we'll eventually have so many disparate units that the units will not have to have any involvement with one another, and we'll have missed an opportunity to be the church in its global nature. So one of the things that I would encourage, and I'm thinking about myself, and I need help. This is not something, I've just exhausted the sum total of my knowledge on social identity. I could go for 4 more hours because I'm a teacher, but that's it. Anyway, but what I need is I need you to help me think about that. And I need it in various conversations. How do we continue to do that? How do I help someone else become all that God has made them to be, at the same time gaining from that more of my understanding of who God is? And that seems to me to be one of the principles that Rich set out yesterday. If we look at Babel and the diversity of Babel, then we look at a diversity that is destructive. If we look at the diversity of Pentecost, we look at the prescriptive of what it will be when the kingdom comes. So there's a sense in which we stand with that theological tension, but we do that a lot, don't we? We're comfortable with that. We live with those tensions. So what I'd like to encourage you to think about, and help me to think about, help Fuller Seminary to think about, is how do we stand beside Asian American concerns in such a way that you know when the chips are down, we're still going to be standing there, that we're together. And we want to facilitate the exploration of identity to the highest degree that we can. At the same time, we don't want to lose the contribution, the glory, if you will, of the emerging identity that's coming about in terms of Asian Americans in understanding who we are together as God's people. It's a wonderful challenge, a wonderful challenge. I just keep looking at the picture in Revelation 5. People from every tribe and tongue and nation. And as a missionary, that preaches. As an academic administrator, it's difficult to create a curriculum that will get there. So one of the things that we have to do is do this theologically and do this sociologically so that we're learning. So all that to say, and my time is up, that I'm really excited about what you're doing, and I mean that as a scholar as well as a leader of Fuller Seminary. And I want you to know that we have high hopes for the future in terms of working together. But we need your input. We are a learning community, and without it, we're not going to make it. One last thing, and I have to do this because Young Lee told me to. We have a cohort that's starting in a Doctor of Missiology. A Doctor of Missiology is a research-based degree. It's between a DMin and a PhD in the academic hierarchy. It's a research-based degree, and it's called Asian North American Missiology. And it's going to be looking at from a missiological perspective, what is God doing and what do we do in order to better understand that amongst Asian Americans in North America? Young Lee is part of it. We have a team of people that are working on it. It starts in the fall. If you're interested, ask her. She'll be able to give you the first-hand input on that. But I just want to say thank you, and God bless the continued work that you do. Amen.